The framework of inquiry in this course will be the landmark decisions of the US Supreme Court, particularly during the Civil Rights Revolution. The reason for this focus is twofold. On the one hand, because it represents what I have referred to as the Gilded Age of the Supreme Court. There is no precedent until 1954 of a Supreme Court taking the constitutional leadership in constitutional creation within the tradition of the United States. So that's on one side. And on the other is that it reflects a distinctive character of litigation that I would also like to illustrate during our course, which is the strategic or structural model of litigation. In contrast to the traditional model of litigation, we can find that constitutional transformations in the US happen very rarely. On very occasional moments of time, they have decided as a polity to change their foundational framework, notwithstanding the fact that they remain with the same constitution that they approved back in Philadelphia in 1787. So the great paradox, not only in the area of constitutional change, but in this sort of American exceptionalism, is precisely to identify that even though they keep the constitution that they got in the founding, notwithstanding that fact, they have experienced at least 4 different constitutional regimes. And those are the constitutional moments that Bruce Ackerman depicts in his long work on We the People. He says that from his view, the constitutional arrangement established in the founding was dramatically or radically changed within history. So at a first constitutional moment, we identify the founding with the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution of 1787. And we will see how the constitutional canon will evolve with the remaining constitutional moments. The next constitutional moment that we will identify is precisely what is called historically the first Reconstruction that succeeds the American Civil War, and the name answers to the need of bringing together the Union after the Northern Army succeeded in defeating the Southern cause of succeeding from the central government in Washington. So the first commitment after the outcome of the Civil War was to bring the country together, and the means to do it, as we will discover, were the so-called Reconstruction Amendments. To be precise, the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments. And we will find that those are not precisely amendments, but they refer to something else. They refer to something that is more radical, more dramatic in the context of constitutional change. So it is downsizing or undermining their significance to call them constitutional amendments as if they were brought to reality following exactly the formal terms of Article 5 of the US Constitution. So we will discover with the Reconstruction Amendments that there is another concept in which we can frame these radical constitutional changes that are not exactly formal as enshrined in the Constitution, Article 5 again, but we will see that they represent something else. Third constitutional moment, the New Deal. It represented the creation of the national state in the American constitutional tradition. So we will see there the creation of not only a new political, but also a new economic model in order to answer to the predicaments that were triggered after the economic crisis of 1929. The way in which the exchanges between the presidency and the court unfolded then represented, from the Ackermanian narrative or the vantage point of Bruce Ackerman, a new constitutional moment, a new time of constitutional redefinition and creation. And fourth, the Civil Rights Revolution after 1954 with Brown v. Board, in which we find for the first time in American history the court leading the strategies for constitutional change. Our seminar will be based mainly in two schools of thought in American jurisprudence. On the one hand, the constitutional historicism of Bruce Ackerman and his constitutional moments theory, and on the other hand, the distinctive procedural approach towards constitutional adjudication of Owen Fiss. The core point is that I would like you to familiarize yourself with this kind of not only conversation, but of these two leading intellectual approaches towards US law and its evolution. One of the distinctive features of American constitutionalism, as portrayed by Samuel Huntington in his great work of Political Order in Changing Societies, is that the great difference that made the American case so exceptional is that their constitutional enterprise came from scratch. At least they had some constitutional experiences in the constitution of some of the 13 colonies. But the interesting thing is that their enterprise for constitutional creation did not have to deal with legacies from the past. In contrast to, for example, the Latin American experiences that most or all of the constitutional enterprise of the 19th century had to dealt with the legacy of mostly Spanish or Portuguese occupation in previous centuries. That was not the case in the US. Remember that they sorted to establish what was called, and it's particularly studied by Hannah Arendt in her essay on revolution, they sorted to establish a novus ordo seclorum, a new political order for the ages. And at the same time, they were able to frame it within what is called by Bruce Ackerman a constitutional canon, comprised by a Declaration of Independence, a Bill of Rights, that both are consolidated in a constitutional text almost 10 years later in the Constitution of 1787. And that constitutional canon, as their constitutional tradition evolves, this very constitutional canon also continues enhancing itself by including super precedents and what he refers to as super statutes. But suffice to say for the moment that once they establish this distinctive arrangement in their foundation and a distinctive type of government in which they envision this system of checks and balances in which no power will overshadow or will eclipse the others, precisely from their bad experience of having an authoritarian background with the British Crown, they devised this system of government, but also they introduced this idea of the supremacy of the Constitution. But here comes the feature that we didn't explore, and I think it's the most relevant for the moment. From the very beginning in the US history, they conveyed the idea that we, the people, at any moment of time in history are entitled to claim ownership over the Constitution. That means that the ownership of the Constitution is not held by courts, nor by the president, or nor by Congress, despite their democratic legitimacy or their political representation nature. The owners of the Constitution is we the people, and therefore they can claim ownership of the Constitution to change it when their considered judgment determines to do so. And that is the underlying argument in which Ackerman justifies this interplay between we the people and their representatives in order to claim this ownership of the Constitution and change it. That is the feature that I'd like you to identify. The idea is that from the founding until 2021, the owners of the Constitution are we the people, and depending on this model of what he describes as dualist democracy, those rare occasions in history in which the considered judgment of the people claim enough entitlement to change the Constitution, they can do it without interference of their political representatives, because they are claiming their original right to change the Constitution, because at the end they own it from the beginning.